Welcome to the next edition of LinkedIn Live Discussions brought to you by Optiv, the cybersecurity advisory and solutions leader. My name is Sean Asmus, Application Security Practice Director here at Optiv and your moderator for today. Now, before we get started, I want to encourage everyone to participate in today's conversation on continuous threat exposure management. Feel free to drop any comments or questions you may have into the chat, and we'll do our best to get them in near the end. Now, all organizations, even the largest and most mature, are really still lagging behind when it comes to reducing their exposure to cyber threats. And with today's advanced threat actors, it's really not hard to understand why. Staying ahead of the game is a tall task for any security team. Those that go at it with a haphazard or siloed or tool-centric approach aren't helping themselves either. Understanding the why we should have processes and defenses that are more adaptive, more comprehensive, and more continuous, well, that's easy. But the question is, how do we do this in a realistic and repeatable manner? So here today to discuss this very topic are Ryan Dorey, Vice President of Threat Management here at Optiv. Ryan's team has an acute understanding of the global threat landscape, where day in and day out, they help clients identify and mitigate vulnerabilities in their environments so they can keep their security posture strong and critical business functions operating normally. Along with Ryan is Josh Dubik. Josh is Optiv's Vice President of Application Security. His team provides comprehensive application security services that enable clients to innovate digitally and securely. And they do this through the identification and mitigation of security risks in application technologies, processes, and code. Welcome, gentlemen, to today's conversation.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. So to kick us off, security is an ongoing process. As we know, it's more of a journey than a destination. What types of things do you feel typically go into attaining this state of what's called continuous security?
Yeah, so if I look at things from an AppSec perspective, continuous security is really an approach that really integrates into all aspects of an SDLC, right? And so it's really an ongoing process that aims to identify, mitigate any of the risks associated with development, deployment, and operation of software. And so we kind of can think of things in a way of a couple elements and practices, right, regarding SDLC. And we've talked about this quite a bit in this industry, and it starts with security by design. And that's really, security should be if you think about it, should be considered from the start of development rather than being added as an afterthought, right? And so this includes things like coding practices, designing secure architectures, conducting regular security reviews early and often. The other side of it is really the automation, right? So we think of DevSecOps and a culture of a technical approach to security, right? Where we're integrating all aspects of security throughout the CI/CD pipeline. So that means that security checks are performed automatically throughout that entire process. And ideally, vulnerabilities are found and identified and fixed before we reach production. And finally, we have the aspect of security monitoring, right? And so monitoring systems and security and the vulnerabilities within those applications can be do so by using various tools and techniques, either through a SIEM or through an IDS. But if you think about the attack surface is much more broader than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Dubik, I appreciate you sharing that from the AppSec perspective, right? It's pretty wild to think about how far things have come, right? I mean, I remember when I first started in the IT space years ago, really the only things to worry about were things that were on-prem on the physical network, internal to the environment, right, with an IP address, right? Obviously, we all know it's far more expansive than that. So it's cloud, software as a service, social media, your code repositories, your physical security, remote workers, IoT, OT, and the list goes on, right? And really, when you talk about continual testing, all these things have to be evaluated. So the landscape has broadened substantially, and I think that's hitting on all those things effectively and really trying to see the sum of their collective efforts is the challenge that we'll be talking about here today.
Yeah, so thanks, guys. So kind of by extension, we're talking about continuous security. So this idea of continuous threat exposure management, which from here I'm just going to call it CTEM for short. So what is it, and when did it start to really gain acceptance in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. If we think about the outcome of a seat, so I'm kind of an outcome driven guy, right? So if we think of the outcome of a CTEM, right, it's to really have a consistent, actionable security like remediation and improvement plan, right? And if we think about the consumers of it, we think about executives to really being able to understand what it is, to be able to support it, and also being able to have architecture teams act upon it, right? And so this program is really designed to continually identify and assess and mitigate threats, right, that are prevalent. And if we think back to 2020, I mean, this is really when organizations started to realize that, hey, we need to be more proactive about cybersecurity, because traditional cybersecurity programs really focus on the reactive measures, right, such as responding to security incidents after they've occurred. And so CTEM programs, on the other hand, focus on preventing, ideally, right? Ideally, as best as possible, and preventing those incidents from happening in the first place or catching them early on in the process.
Exactly right. So, as I mentioned earlier, some of the continuous approaches, right? If you have recurring pen testing, continual ASM scanning, you're leveraging multiple threat feeds, intel feeds, etc., and you even have some type of programmatic remediation efforts in place, and you do a yearly tabletop exercise, right? These are all tremendous things that help you with your continual program of creating that security posture that your business is seeking, right? But the challenge is that all those separate efforts are disparate in nature and don't fully speak to one another. And how does a business truly measure the collective success of those individual efforts, right? So really, the goal here is to create a marriage, right, or of threat detection and response, or mediation to compliance, right? Really, is kind of like a unifying construct to help all these work together into a overlay over the business.
Yeah, I like the phrase unifying construct. So the concept of a framework, essentially. So, so it sounds like CTEM is just more than a pretty new acronym for us to learn about. And Ryan, you mentioned ASM, which is attack surface management. So, can you guys talk about how CTEM programs are different than, say, an ASM program or a vulnerability management program?
Yeah, I like the word different there, right? It's not better. It's different. It's an overlay. I would say ASM and VM, specifically vulnerability management programs, right? They're levers or tools in the tool belt to be utilized in your overarching security program, right? So really, CTEP could be a broader methodology or approach to that security, right? It's looking at your business objectives, your relevant threat intel, your risk tolerances, your compliance drivers, and it really works to involve all of these to involve a breadth of stakeholders far beyond just that of security individuals, right? It needs executive buy-in, it needs a business vision, and et cetera. And so it should really tie all those things in together, which is, again, back to your specific question, it's far more comprehensive than more the narrow objectives or views of those ASM or VM initiatives.
Yeah, and I think combining really like the combination, right, of CTEM, ASM, VM. I mean, if you think about that, creates a comprehensive security strategy, right? And so that allows organizations to continually monitor and assess their entire security posture, their applications, right, and identify and assess to be able to remediate any vulnerabilities within their environment. So
yeah, that's good.
It's a perfect marriage, Ryan, right? Is that what you said earlier? So it kind of is.
Yep.
Good stuff, guys. So, and I want to circle back on one of those points in a bit, but let's talk about, since you're an outcomes guy, Josh, what would you consider some of the attributes of an effective CTEM program? What would good look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I think about an outcome, right? Faster response times and remediation times. I want to see evidence, right, of any blocked or mitigated attacks, lower vulnerability presence, right? A prevalence in the infrastructure. And if I look at, okay, some components, right? Some attributes of CTEM, obviously like it's continuous monitoring, right? And so the program needs to be able to continually monitor the entire security posture of the org. And we're just not talking from an AppSec perspective, right? So network systems, apps, everything in between. Ryan called out a good point earlier as well with, acting on threat intelligence, paying attention to the threat intelligence, being able to consume it and, socialize it within your organization, looking at latest threats and vulns. I mean, that's huge. Risk assessment, right? So you should use a risk assessment, to identify and assess the organization and your security risks. Remediation, obviously we talked about that, and continuous improvement, right? So what are you doing with that data?
Yep. Thanks, Josh. And I won't go into it, but there are 5 stages that I would encourage folks to look up, right? From the scoping, discovery, prioritization, validation, and mobilization, right? The first 3 are really on the detecting side, and then the latter 2 are on the, how do you react to it, right? And your second question there, Sean, what measurements of success? How do you understand that these efforts are worthwhile in improving your security posture, reducing the risk to your organization with minimal impact and things along those lines? And Josh hit on a couple of them, right? But risk reduction, that's kind of the obvious one, but that can be quantified through less vulnerabilities in general or fewer high severity vulnerabilities persisting over a period of time, right? A lot of times organizations really struggle in making meaningful improvements in their VM efforts, right? Because if they take 10,000 vulns and get it down to 1,000, they think they've done a 90% reduction. But if those 1,000 are the highest risk or impact, they've not improved their posture in a meaningful manner, right? So risk reduction through things along those lines, or really the number of incidents that may occur throughout the year, right? Improved threat detection. This could be achieved through more effective monitoring of endpoints, threat intel feeds, etc. I think Josh might have touched on a little bit, but time to remediate. This is a critical metric, right? Tracking and reducing the amount of time from detection to effective mitigation or remediation. Security control effectiveness, and utilizing tools such as like a BAS, right? Can offer some quantitative measurements there. And then really the one we haven't talked about too much is a lot of compliance metrics, right? So if applicable, reducing the number of compliance violations that are occurring, or really increasing the amount of time spent fully compliant. And then the last kind of a differentiating one for this overarching concept is having this be an actual business priority, right? That is bought in by stakeholders far beyond that of the security team and really contributed to by, like I said, that broader audience.
Yeah, that's really good. That brings me to the next question. So thinking about a large organization where, it sometimes it feels like you're trying to move mountains to accomplish anything, and especially deploy new programs. So like in the context of CTEM here, when organizations go to, implement and deploy a program, inevitably there will be stakeholders from a wide variety of different teams, right? Security, risk, threat detection and response, cloud, app dev, etc. So what are some of the barriers do you guys think they'll face as they attempt to bring these folks together to the same table?
I think we've all been there where we struggle to, launch a new process, especially like an iterative process where we experience really a siloing of teams and process, right? Because if you think of teams are often siloed, right? And they have their own business objectives and goals, right? They have their own tools and technologies that can make it extremely difficult to collaborate and share information. And then you have lack of communication, right? So whenever there's a lack of communication between already siloed environment, this can lead to just massive misunderstandings, duplication of effort, and really, from my perspective, a lot of missed opportunities. And obviously we have, with the siloing comes different priorities, right? And so teams may have different priorities, which can really make it difficult to agree on a common goal. And if you couple all of this, right, with a lack of resources in an organization, it's going to be very difficult to implement. It's going to be difficult to maintain that process, right? It could be due to lack of budget, staff, or expertise. And then finally, change is inevitable, right? And when we are resistant to change, that's very natural for human nature, right? So teams may be resistant to that change, and it's going to be very difficult to overcome that.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some very good operational concerns that could be in place, right? And from a technical side, um, like you mentioned, beyond all the operational things, is data, right? So CTEM is heavily reliant upon effective real-time analysis of what's going to ultimately be a lot of disparate data streams. Again, coming from things such as your network, ASM tools, endpoints, Intel feeds, and et cetera. So being able to digest that data in a meaningful and efficient manner is going to be a critical dependency there. Having effective response things in place, right? So that could be from automation or even relevant, response playbooks and the like. And then ultimately, one of the last challenges is this is not a set it and forget it initiative, right? So it's going to be the growth or evolution of the program itself. So as an organization grows or threats increase or become more relevant for your specific organization, CTEM needs to adapt accordingly, right? Ensuring that it's always congruent with the threats intended to mitigate against and the organization is trying to protect.
Yes, so let's dig into that a little bit. I like where this is going. So, thinking about some of the challenges of scaling out a program like this, what would you consider common areas of concern? When organizations go and deploy a CTEM program. Josh, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So in addition to all the roadblocks that I kind of highlighted earlier, right, with regard to remediation, right? So even just the sheer volume of remediation and the general noise, right, versus the actual like contextual risk of like, reducing or reacting to and prioritizing what actually makes sense to the organization, right? That could be very problematic. And it really goes back to not understanding kind of your risk-based assessment, right? It also goes back to not having a clear plan or objective of what the program should entail.
Yeah, that's good. Ryan, any follow-up comments?
I think Joshua nailed that one.
All right, sounds good. So, I mean, a lot of the industry knowledge around CTEM really came from Gartner, and Gartner is based on the report that came out last year, recommending that organizations not follow vendor narratives when designing their CTEM program. Can you guys talk a little bit about why this is important?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, in our business, we work with a lot of vendors. We work with a lot of products, and products have their place, right? And so it all comes down to really understanding the needs of your organization, understanding the landscape. So really start by assessing your organization's security posture and defining goals and choosing the right tools and technologies based on your organizational needs. But more importantly, having a team of experts that can help with that and help understand and navigate that because the security landscape changes daily, right? And so oftentimes your team of experts will work with the product vendors to ensure that their security narratives, their recommendations are all up to date and they're in line with your organization objectives.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I think very simply put, it's just something to be aware of, right? Every vendor has something they can contribute, but ultimately, I think they're part of the overarching puzzle and solution, and just something to keep in mind when you're building that out.
yeah, that's good. So, I'd like to maybe kind of circle back and take maybe the perspective of a risk manager. So like CTEM is more of that upper level organizational framework for deploying better risk management, better security across an organization. From a seat of or the role of a risk manager, where exposure management may be less or maybe equally about business context than risk context. Can you guys talk a little bit about how an organization, especially a large enterprise, can arrive at a shared understanding of risk or the meaning of risk context?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to understand a couple factors, right? When we look at the organizational objectives, right? Understanding, okay, the goals and objectives of the organization, the list of key assets, and any critical process, right? And then so kind of going down another level would be the external factors, right? Understanding external threats and vulnerabilities that face the organization, regulatory and legal requirements, right? That the organization must comply with. And also like what industry trends and developments that could impact the organization. And then finally, there's an internal kind of environment aspect to this, right? And so what are the organization's internal strengths? What are their weaknesses? What security controls and process are in place? And ultimately, we talked about some of those roadblocks earlier. What's the culture towards risk within the organization?
Yeah, I think you absolutely nailed that at a higher level, right? And just to throw in, I guess, a little bit of something in the weeds, a little bit, right? So, I mean, a specific risk scenario could be, assessing if there's an asset or a service exposed, on your perimeter or public-facing landscape, right? Are you able to pull that back in? And if you're not, what are the compensating controls putting around that, right? And so, understanding what risk exists by still having that out there and understanding the correlation to the impact to your business if it were to be compromised, right? And then, understanding how you can react to minimize the damage. So really having a broader and, a deep understanding of risk as it relates to the organization and the technologies in play.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to throw another term at you all, and hopefully we can extend the discussion here. So security posture optimization, right? So this is also gaining ground in the industry. People are talking about it. And this is likely an extension of cloud security posture management, application security posture management, data, and so on, right? So let's talk about what CTEM brings to the table when it comes to security posture optimization, or like what needs to happen in a program for it to remain relevant and effective over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking back to just some of the challenges that we see with a lot of folks that we work with, and just I think it starts with wanting to implement every security control under the sun, right? And so and really we need to take a step back and only implement those controls as needed, right? And so as new threats and vulnerabilities emerge, implementing that strategy, right, as needed to mitigate those risks. And ultimately getting buy-in from senior management, right? And so in order to stay relevant, you have to be able to maintain your program. In order to be able to maintain your program, you need support, you need budget, you need training. And that's a key thing to be successful. And ultimately, if we go back to our risk profile, right, we have to review and update that risk profile on a regular basis. So because that risk profile and risk management strategy will change over time. And you have to align that with the organization's objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at the end of the day, I won't go down the 14, cybersecurity cliches or analogies, right? But this is not a set it and forget it program, nor is this a tool that you simply purchase, implement, and walk away from, right? And expect it just to operate effectively in perpetuity, right? Technology is incredibly dynamic. Businesses and their objectives are incredibly dynamic and always changing and retracting or growing, expanding, etc. So ultimately, you hit the nail on the head, Josh. It has to constantly be evaluated to make sure it's congruent with your business objectives, your security exposures, and things along those lines. So it's something that has to be worked on continuously as well.
Yeah, so when it comes to like budgets and buying cycles and things like that, it brings to mind maybe the specific industries or maybe the size of companies that should be embarking on developing a CTEM program. So is there a specific size of company that should be doing this today?
I don't know if I would put a specific number of employees or gross revenue or the like, but I think more of a generic answer there is no. I don't think there is a too small of an entity, right? That shouldn't be having some type of mindset in this vein. There is nothing that precludes even smaller organizations from having a proactive, continual mindset to their security posture, even if their landscape is tremendously smaller. There's nothing that prevents them from having that continual and intentional effort. Obviously, there's budget and FTE constraints and the like, but still, that doesn't preclude them from making some effort on a continual basis.
Yeah, I really think it's CTEM is a valuable approach, right, to any company size. So yeah, absolutely, Ryan. Agree with you totally.
Makes sense. So I'd like to wrap it up, but with one last question from my side, at least. So going back to Gartner. So Gartner predicts that, and I'm going to read this, by 2026, organizations prioritizing their security investments based on a continuous exposure management program will be 3 times less likely to suffer from a breach. Do you guys agree?
That's going to be that. That's difficult. I think if I look at, in contrast to a traditional security program, right, that's very reactive in nature. I think organizations are going to benefit from being more proactive regardless. So could that minimize the attack surface? Potentially. There's no guarantees. Like, there's also a saying that nothing is 100% secure, right? And so, yeah, I do think that CTEM can help organizations reduce their risk, in a number of ways, right? And so if we think of, okay, we identify and remediating security vulnerabilities before they get exploited, I think is huge. Helping organizations prioritize their security investments, like essentially think of it as a roadmap of where to spend your money, where your risk is, and improving the overall security posture, right? There's so many benefits to that. Will organizations be 3 times, less likely to suffer a breach? I don't know, but I do think it will give them a better chance.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to understand the math or logic. I find that very interesting and intriguing. But I think I absolutely agree with the sentiment and the narrative, and the direction, right? Is that there's no world where putting in concerted, holistic, comprehensive efforts doesn't improve your security posture, because really CTEM is not looking for zero-day vulnerabilities in those incredible edge cases, because most incidences and compromises aren't from those type of edge case scenarios, right? They're from misconfigurations, too much data leakage over here through social media. It's just a part of an overarching narrative or puzzle that a threat actor put together, right? So I think this will absolutely improve the security posture of larger organizations, or really any organization, again, that utilizes it and puts a concerted effort towards it.
Yeah, it makes sense. Very good. Well, it looks like we're at time, gentlemen. Josh, Brian, thank you very much, both of you, for the conversation and the insights today. Thank you, audience, for joining Optiv for our LinkedIn Live. If anyone is interested in learning more, please connect with us at optiv.com. The recording of the video will be posted out there as always, so look for it if you couldn't catch it live today. Again, thanks again, everyone, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks all. It's been fun.